Hi everybody, I'm Francisco Gil-White for Management of Reality and Arutz Taub in this joint program. And I'm very pleased to welcome Gadi Taub. Thank you for joining us, Gadi.
A pleasure. Thank you very much for having
Very
me.
briefly, Gadi is a historian teaching at Hebrew University, am I correct?
Yeah.
And he has two podcasts. One is called Israel Update, is that right?
Yeah.
And another podcast is called
Gatekeeper.
Gatekeeper,
Shamel
that's right.
Saf in
That's
Hebrew.
right. So Gatekeeper has just won a prize for the second most viewed podcast in its category of political analysis, right?
That's the second most important. I don't know if they count views, but it's a vote.
Somehow they decided
It's
that
a
this
vote.
is the second most
and I
important.
was beaten only by N12, the
You're-
conglomerate, the channel.
You're a cultural force. You're a cultural force in Israel and therefore in the West.
In the podcast, I started the podcast with a shabby camera against my laundry cabinet in the Corona days.
Wow. But content matters.
Yeah, content matters.
Content matters. Okay, so Gadi is also perhaps the foremost expert on Israel's constitutional crisis, which is the topic we're going to discuss today. And I want to just open the topic by prefacing with Gadi's own preface, which I have heard him explain, which is that when Gadi explains this topic of Israel's constitutional crisis, he says most people react like, you must be kidding, you must be joking, you must be making this up. How could this possibly be real? Nobody wants to believe what he's explaining when he's explaining it to people who are outside of Israel, because the structure of Israel's constitutional crisis is truly very crazy. So
Yeah.
you agree with that assessment, right?
Absolutely. I have to say first that I'm, by profession, I am not a legal expert on constitutional law.
Okay.
I come from the angle of political science and political theory. And from our point of view, the whole discourse of Israel's constitution is completely skewed by obfuscating judicial sounding terms.
I see.
In political science, we ask, who holds sovereignty?
Right.
The question is simple. And if sovereignty is defined as the authority of final decision over the political and legal sphere, then sovereignty in Israel resides with the Supreme Court.
Okay, let me explain what I understand to be the structure, and you will correct me, because I want to make a very quick and dirty summary of the structure we are presently in. Then you can tell us very briefly how we got there, very summarized, because I would like to discuss with you what's behind, okay? What's behind this constitutional crisis. So, as I understand it, the structure we're in right now is one where the Supreme Court has basically invented Israel's constitution by declaring that the basic laws, there's a few laws that are considered basic laws. So there was a prior understanding that the basic laws would one day be the substance of a gradually built constitution. This was the original idea, right? But the situation we're in right now is one where the Supreme Court, on its own authority, has decided that the basic laws are already Israel's constitution, or they gave those laws the rank of constitutional law. Moreover, the Supreme Court can stop the Knesset from making new basic laws if they don't like them, right?
Yeah, so there's a two-tier problem here.
Okay.
First, they decided that the constitutional laws are a constitution that,
Right.
and they invented for themselves the power of the judicial review
Right.
to strike down
regular
regular legislation.
attempt, right? But not only
regular legislation. So in a way, they sanctified the basic laws, but now they changed the system completely, and now they exercise judicial review over basic laws. That means that first they said, tier one,
Right.
you have a semi-constitution and they strike down laws. Now they built another one, and on this tier they can strike down the laws based on which they acquired the power of judicial review. So they're basically
It's Kafka.
They're basically cutting the tree that they are sitting on and building with it. It's a Münchhausen.
It's
kind
built
of-
on air.
Yeah, it's built on nothing. And what do they say? If you want to exercise judicial review over constitutional law, on the basis of what do you strike down constitutional laws, absent the Constitution? Well, they invented something called the fundamental principles of the system. Nobody knows what that is.
Well, they call it reasonableness, right?
Reasonableness is one of these
one
things.
of these,
but the idea that there are some fundamental principle of the system accessible only to jurists means that they can invent principles written nowhere and decide that there are our fundamental law beyond the Constitution.
Interesting.
And based on that, change our Constitution.
So it's
Again,
like an occultist club.
Completely. And if you look at it again from the point of view of political science, then you understand that what they do, it doesn't matter if you call our constitutional laws constitution or not. These are the laws that regulate the operation and the relations of the branches of government.
Right.
So now they have taken control on the laws that regulate their own institution. So when I say Münchhausen, I don't have a hair to pull myself up by, but you do, and they do. And,
Still a little bit.
And this is a situation we are in. And when you call them out, you know, my favorite metaphor for this is we have seen the old man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. And he keeps saying, don't mind the old man behind the curtain. And they're manipulating
that's a good metaphor.
Our politics from there. And what they've created, from a political science point of view, what they created is a complete divorce of authority from accountability. They have final authority over everything. They're not accountable
to anyone.
And this is why there is now a struggle in Israel over the Vadat Chakira Mamlachtit, the state commission of inquiry to the
October 7th.
disaster of October 7th.
Okay, so I want to help people outside of Israel.
But I just wanted to say
sure.
that a state commission of inquiry, what they are asking for, would be appointed by the court and would therefore not hold the court accountable.
I see.
And we are saying, no, we want a commission that would also inquire the role of the court leading to the disaster.
I see. Oh, that's very interesting. We'll get to this. I want to help audiences outside of Israel to understand this a little better. So I think the way to do that is to compare what happens in a regular modern Western democracy to what is now happening in Israel. So in a modern Western democracy, the idea is you have a written constitution, and that constitution requires laws passed by the parliament to be consistent with it. You can't pass secondary laws that are in any way contradictory to what's written in the Constitution. But it doesn't. But the Supreme Court doesn't write those secondary laws. The secondary laws are written by the legislative power. They are the ones with the power to create new law. The power of a Supreme Court is to say whether the new laws passed by the legislative power are consistent or inconsistent with the Constitution. But they don't have the power to make new law, right? However, what is happening now in Israel is that, forgive me, and what usually takes place in a modern democracy is that, what normatively takes place is that if someone believes that a secondary law is in contradiction with the Constitution, then there has to be a process that begins in the lower courts, right? You create a challenge to the law, right? And the lower courts, if they cannot decide on the constitutionality of the law, or if the decision is kicked up to a higher court, eventually the controversy may arrive at the Supreme Court, where there is some final resolution on the constitutionality of what the legislative body did. Now, but what is happening in Israel is that the Supreme Court can decide that some secondary law will not take effect even before there is any controversy, even before anybody challenges it in the lower courts. Is this true?
Not exactly, because the problem is that everybody challenges everything. I'll give you a number to give you the feeling of what I mean. The Supreme Court in the United States, I think, decides 70 to 90 cases a year. The Israeli Supreme Court decides 12,000. everybody can appeal. It's called standing. Everyone can appeal anything in the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court has turned itself to an uber government, which has, as I said, final decision over anything. It could be an appointment, it could be a military plan of attack, it could be a budget.
Okay, so this is something that never happens in any other Western democracy. It's important to understand that. When the executive says, I want to fire the head of the education department and replace that person with a new head of the education department, it is understood that the head of the executive, as an elected executive, has the power to build his own team in the executive branch and to decide who is in it and who is not in it, right? This is understood. That's the power of the executive. But in Israel, if the Supreme Court doesn't like the person that the executive is firing, doesn't like the fact that the executive is firing someone, or doesn't like the person that the executive is hiring, the Supreme Court can stop those appointments from happening. Is this true?
Yeah, they can stop anything, and they can overrule anything. I have to say, in the West, there are many countries in which there is a permanent bureaucracy, which is very hard to fire. If you are the Prime Minister of Britain, then it is not clear that you can fire the permanent civil servants.
But you can fire the political positions, the ones at the top.
The political positions you can fire, and what is most important, you can fire the heads of the armed services, because it is a fundamental characteristic of democracy that the armed forces are subordinate to the civil authority.
Right.
And here in Israel, we now see that the head of the secret police is fired by the cabinet according to the law and says, I'm not moving from my chair and I'm going to appeal this to or someone is going to appeal this to the Supreme Court. And the whole left is clapping and clamoring for Ronen Bar, the head of the Secret Service, for standing up for democracy.
Okay,
and what kind of definition of democracy is that you are standing up for the supremacy of the secret police over the civil authority?
Okay, so just so that people outside of Israel know what we're talking about, very recently, in the last few days, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he was firing Ronen Bar, who is the head of
Shin Bet.
Head of Shin Bet, the Israeli clandestine service, the secret service, and this crisis resulted because he doesn't want to leave, and he knows that the Supreme Court is probably on his side, right? So he wants this to become a controversy in the Supreme Court, because then he can keep his job. Netanyahu won't be able to fire him, is the understanding, right?
Yeah, he took a page out of James Comey's book,
right.
Who embroiled Donald Trump in an investigation in order to prevent Donald Trump from finding out the origin of the investigation, which was an attempt to spy on his campaign. And we had 3 years of crazy news about Russian collusion that never existed because they wanted to paralyze the president with an investigation. This is what Ronen Bar is doing now. And the Prime Minister published a video in which he says, look, they are now saying that I can't fire Ronen Bar because that is an attempt to stop the investigation against the people of my staff. But he showed the dates and said it's completely the other way around. Ronen Bar understood that he was going to be fired, and therefore he started an investigation in order to blame me for ulterior motives.
Interesting. Okay, now there's one more thing I'd like people to understand. There is a functionary called the legal advisor to the government, right? This is I think that's the official title.
No, the official title in English is confusingly Attorney General. While you're right, in Hebrew, she is the legal counsel to the executive.
Okay, so the legal counsel to the executive is the name of this position. And the understanding that has developed from the activity of the Supreme Court of Israel and the interpretations they have been pushing is that this person, the legal counsel,
the legal counsel,
counsel to the executive, according to his or her own judgment, can decide whether what the government is doing, whatever it is constitutional or not. And this person doesn't really answer to the executive, even though the legal the title might suggest that. This person, in fact, in truth, is an extension of the Supreme Court's power, right? So we have a functionary who is an extension of the Supreme Court's power with the power to decide whether any little activity, with the smallest activity of the executive is legal or not.
Yeah, she can veto any action by the executive, and this is an invention of our Supreme Court, because they took this job of the legal counsel that has a problem. She's also the head of the prosecution. So you understand that in the cabinet sits someone who gives you advice on the one hand, but can open an investigation against you on the other. And they've often used it. They have often, many mazurs especially, almost explicitly threatened the cabinet when they tried to separate the functions of the Attorney General and the legal counsel. And then the Supreme Court invented something which has no parallel anywhere in the democratic world. It's that the advice of the legal counsel is obligatory. You have to, it's a dictate, basically. And secondly, that she has a monopoly on representing the government. So if you're the government, this is your legal counsel, you can hire no other, and someone tells you, I'm gonna petition the Supreme Court about this policy, and the Attorney General doesn't like it, and she says, I'm not gonna represent you.
Would you consider it an exaggeration to state that the Supreme Court has destroyed Israeli democracy?
Oh, it absolutely has.
So it's not an exaggeration.
Israel is not a democracy. We should stop with this silly game. Israel, the sovereignty, the final authority to decide everything, resides with 15 judges. If you come from political science, it's very clear to you. These are the people ruling the country. They have veto power over the appointment of their associates. And what is worse, they are woke and left. The median opinion in the court is more or less that of Meretz, a party too far left to
even exist now.
To have passed the threshold to the parliament. So we have something outside the spectrum of the Israeli electorate ruling Israel. And at one point, this structure is bound to break. And they are becoming more and more entrenched. In the days of the reform, they could have gone for some compromise. They just amass more and more power, and they think that officially having that power means you can hold it forever. Now their supporters want to force a constitution which will make permanent the contemporary arrangement. But the idea that you can, in a free society, impose the rules of the minority forever on the majority against its will and in direct confrontation with their opinions is ridiculous. It's like Aaron Barak said. He said, if I were the Supreme Court chief of Germany in the 30s, Hitler will not come to power. And this is a ridiculous illusion. What Hitler came to power on the clubs of 3 million SA people running amok in the streets. Do you think that you can stand with a book and say, no, you're doing something illegal? I'm gonna send the police to arrest you, while he can basically burn the country. That's ridiculous.
Okay, so I think this conversation is useful to people outside of Israel who have gotten the impression from the controversy in the streets that the people agitating in the streets in favor of the Supreme Court are defending democracy, because that's what a lot of people believe. But in fact, the Supreme Court is destroying democracy, and therefore the way to save them or restore democracy in Israel would be to put the Supreme Court back in its place where it belongs, with the powers that are legitimately the powers of the judicial branch.
Ask yourself, is there a limit to the Supreme Court's power? Is there a check or a balancing force against it? The answer is no. There is no counter force that it cannot subdue, and there is no limit to its authority. And when I asked, I sat with the discourse on the left has been corrupted so far that it become puree, a mush of terms. And I asked this journalist, prominent journalist in Haaretz, what is the limit? Is there a limit to the Supreme Court's power? And he said, of course there is. And I said, well, what is it? He said, the Supreme Court will decide what it is. And so this is where we are. This is Haaretz. This is not some, taxi driver. He's supposed to instruct the public about these very topics.
Okay, let's get into the topic of the ideology behind the Supreme Court's coup against Israeli democracy. I've heard you explain, and I'd like to explain to our audiences, about the effect that the Supreme Court's power has had on the security of the Jewish state. So what I've heard you explain is that because the woke ideology of the Supreme Court justices of Israel is well known, right? People understand more or less what they think, and therefore what they will approve and what they will forbid. What I've heard you explain is that when people are doing policy that is relevant to the security of the Jewish state, they design it so that it will get approved by the justices.
They curb it.
Right. Well, what that means is that they have to design the policies so that they hurt the security of the Israeli state, because that's what the justices apparently want. Am I understanding this argument?
This is the judges are imposing incredibly strict and progressive interpretations of international law. I'll give you one crazy example. It's so crazy that when Amit Segal published it for the first time, people just ignored it. When I published it after Amit Segal, the situation was getting worse. Everyone says this was a conspiracy theory. And what I said is, the Bibas family was viciously murdered.
Yes.
We know.
Yes.
2 children and a woman.
Babies.
And the IDF knew who the people who kidnapped them were and where they were. And we were not allowed to hit them because they do not belong formally to Hamas or Islamic Jihad. And therefore, the Attorney General of the IDF said that they are civilians protected by the first protocol of the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention is intended to protect civilians who get caught in the midst of fire. So if you're in a combat zone in Ukraine and you pick up a weapon to defend yourself, you are still a civilian and you are protected. And after you lay down your weapon, the other army, it's illegal to shoot you. But these are not civilians getting caught in a combat zone. This is part of a terrorist invasion of our country, people who committed crimes against humanity. Why on earth should the IDF protect them based on the Geneva Convention? This is absurd, and this is how they're acting. Now, what they do is they erase their own fingerprints, usually. How does that happen? Take, for example, the perimeter. Once upon a time, I'm taking you back to the year 2000. Doron Almog, who was commander of the Southern, General Doron Almog, commander of the Southern Theater, created a perimeter which was a death zone. You cannot go near
We're talking about the Gaza fence.
Yeah,
the border
exactly.
fence in Gaza.
But and the death zone was inside Gaza. You cannot approach
Now
the fence.
explain what the death zone means in practical terms. What
It
does
means
mean?
that if you enter it, you get a bullet in the head and you die. And that's a very strong deterrent. And then NGOs started to appeal, say, well, there's some people get in accidentally, you can't prove that they had bad intentions, and they started to petition the court. The court rejected the petitions. And so the defenders of the court say, what do you want? The court heard the case and rejected the petition. But they did not reject them on the face of it. And this means they accepted them for deliberation. And in this space between accepting for deliberation and rejecting the petition, the court demands answer from the army. And now the army changes the answer gradually to fit the expectations of the court. And the court and the judges say, we have written down that you committed to ABC. And this is how the parameter was gradually eroded till the Israeli sharpshooters could only shoot in the ankle people who were clearly terrorists. All the others could get to the fence. And this is how October 7th came. October 7th came because they have, with foresight, gradually got us used to their presence near the fence. And we failed to raise the alarm.
Okay, so what is your explanation for the fact that the justices on the Supreme Court of Israel seem to have a bias or an ideology that is in favor of making the Jewish state more vulnerable? How do you explain that?
Yeah.
Because it's not just this rule.
It's
the general pattern.
Oh, they are in the same way they are eroding the law of return, and they're eroding the difference between legal and illegal immigrants. So they are.
So would you say that
they're undermining the Jewish state?
It's an anti-Israeli ideology.
I'm not sure. They have an ideal, and they see it as their job and their purview to protect their conceptions of universal human rights.
Right, but universal is not Israeli.
Yeah, right? Exactly. And so they want Israeli democracy to abide also by these standards, but they are employing them so strictly that they're undermining the collective right of the Jewish people to
defend themselves.
To self-defense and even for self-determination. And there's a sociological aspect to it. They want to find favor with judges around the world when they're invited to conferences, and so they want to be able to say that they have stood up to the power and protected human rights.
So in other words,
secondly,
they want to please anti-Semitic legal minds outside of Israel.
No, I wouldn't say that. They want to be accepted. And that's not necessarily anti-Semitic minds, it's progressive minds and woke minds.
You think there's a difference?
Yes, I think, although most progressives end up rejecting Israel too, but the thing is they're anti-national. The crux of the issue is not always anti-Semitic.
But they seem to be much more focused on Israel than any other country.
America. They're also focused on America.
Right.
If you look at their,
right, but they are especially interested in Israel and the United States. So we could call them anti-Israel and anti-American, anti-Semitic and anti-American.
And anti-national, because they're also anti-Hungarian. They're anti any country that asserts its right to protect its national identity.
So could we capture this ideology then by calling it pro-jihadi? Anywhere that people want to assert their national right to self-defense from jihadi forces, these woke people are against that.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that jihad is their conscious ally or the goal of their policies. They are, the way I see it, they are a form of autoimmune disease that the West has, in which it is more important to purify yourself by self-flagellation and declare your own guilt than it is to protect your culture and identity. And so in the name of the most radical interpretation of your own culture, you let in the very elements that would destroy it. So the woke always say that they're against racism, but they're not against racism. They're against the racism of one group. They're not against the racism of blacks. They're not against the racism of jihadists. That's fine with them, because we cannot blame, and if you look at the whole woke structure, as Batya Unger wisely put it, they have replaced good and evil with weak and strong. And the weak is always right.
That's correct.
So when a Palestinian rapes to death, literally, a Jewish woman, it is her fault, because he has no agency.
Right. That's a form of racism. They're never responsible.
Yeah. It is a form of racism.
They're Arabs, therefore they're never responsible for their behavior.
I've said it a million times, but they're not interested in this criticism, because they are interested in a false sense of moral superiority, in a form of grandstanding and moralism, which is the expense of morality. I'll tell you something very harsh about the Jewish woke, among American liberals, some of which have turned into our enemies. If J Street is promoting an embargo on our weapons in the midst of a war, they are enemies. And so there is a growing danger of Muslim anti-Semitism in the United States. And Yigal Carmon, from memory, the Middle Eastern Media Research Institute, compiled a file of sermons of North American imams in the United States preaching wild anti-Semitism. And he came to Jewish leaders with this. And everybody on the center and and all the way up to the left refused to touch it for fear of being labeled Islamophobic. And now, as one of my favorite commentators say, Andrew McCarthy says, Islamophobia is not a phobia. It is a term invented by the Muslim Brotherhood in order to discourage inquiry into Sharia supremacist ideology.
Right. I agree with that.
And Jewish leaders, instead of tending to their own flock, instead of protecting their own congregations, want to find favor with the woke and are not raising the alarm.
So let's talk about that. So it seems to me that the behavior of the Supreme Court, which, as we've discussed, is infected by this, the Supreme Court is infected by this woke ideology. It seems to me that their behavior, their norms, their values are consistent with the Oslo process, with the Oslo Accords. True. Because what the Oslo Accords did was bring into Israel an organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So if we were to say that their behaviors are well explained by an ideology that seeks to destroy the security of the Jewish state, well, it easily explains the Oslo Accords and also everything else.
I think you're ascribing intentionality that they do not consciously have. I think that their whole worldview, which tends to globalism, depends on the assumption that peace with the Palestinians is possible. So they imagine a Palestinian people that does not exist. They imagine a peace that, first of all, they imagine a universal human nature, which is in which the highest goal is individual economic well-being. And so we completely misunderstood the Palestinians because we assume that if they are advancing and improving their standard of living, it cannot be that they will attack us. Because they will not lose that. So the Supreme Court has the same view. It ascribes to everyone their own misconception of themselves. Because I don't think that even in the West, people are really this homo economicus, which only cares about a standard of living.
Right. So, so I want to push back a little bit on your understanding of this. So we know, maybe the public does, everybody in the public doesn't know, but you and I know that the Oslo vote, Oslo II, passed by one vote. It had a one-vote margin. When Oslo I and Oslo II were voted on in the Knesset, the Israeli public was not told, for example, by their bosses, by the people running the Israeli government, that PLO Fatah, the organization that was brought into Israel to become the Palestinian Authority, right, and to become the local government over the Arabs in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, which are militarily strategic territories, right? The Israeli public was not told that PLO Fatah was the creator of jihadi Iran. Did you know this? Is this news to you?
Yeah, it is news to me.
Well, it's still news. It's still news to a lot of people in Israel. So I traveled to Israel about 12 years ago, and I gave 2 conferences on this topic to rooms that were full of the people who fight jihadism inside Israel.
You mean the Shiite revolution in Iran?
That's correct.
By the PLO.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
That sounds like a stretch to me.
Okay, fine. I'll send you the documentation. Listen to this. This was explained on the front page of the New York Times in 1979 when the Islamic Revolution in Iran happened. It was explained on the front page of the New York Times. This is not a secret. It was explained that PLO Fatah, Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas had armed and trained Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas in Lebanon. No, not okay. No. They trained and armed Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas in Lebanon in the 1970s.
But
wait,
now.
hold on, let me finish.
Okay.
And when when those guerrillas fought the Islamic Revolution and triumphed, and they put Ayatollah Khomeini in power in Iran, the first people invited to celebrate with Khomeini the Islamic Revolution were Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas and their buddies, and they helped Ayatollah Khomeini create the terrorist institutions of the new jihadi Iranian state. Front page of the New York Times. Okay? So it's not a secret. They stopped talking about it after about 1982, 1983. They never mentioned this again. And they built this alternative reality where supposedly PLO, Fatah, and Iran were now no longer friends, and so on and so forth. And everybody forgot about this. But in the second Intifada, it became clear that this was a managed reality because Iran and PLO Fatah worked very closely in the second Intifada. So you still don't know about this. Most Israelis still don't know about this.
Yeah, but
well, hold on. What follows from this is that when the Oslo Accords were voted on in the Knesset, the people running the Israeli government who did know about this, because it was not a secret, and of course the intelligence services know about this, they did not explain to the Israeli citizens that they were bringing Iran into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state. That to me looks like intention. It's not that they're confused. It's not that they have a bad ideology that prevents them from understanding the world. It's that they didn't want Israelis to know, because if they had known, it only took one vote. You only had to change one vote to sabotage the Oslo Accords. So it was necessary to keep a complete silence about this in order to get the Oslo vote approved. So anyway, this is just to give you context, and I'll send you the documentation later on this.
Please do. Look, what the press here tried to suppress was the jihadi intentions of Yasser Arafat. Whether Iranian or not, we can debate, but clearly Yasser Arafat never meant peace with Israel.
So you're saying the Israeli media is also completely infected by the same ideology that the Supreme Court is
not all
suffering
of it
from?
any longer. As you know, we are sitting in the Taub channel.
Well, let's say the big
studio.
media, the mainstream
the mainstream media. And again, the same Yigal Karmon, which I mentioned in relation to North American imams, was an Arabist. He was the advisor on terrorism to two prime ministers, Rabin and Shamir. And he was an intelligence officer. So when Arafat arrived here in '94, he took there were clunky video cassettes back then. So he took the speeches of Arafat and put subtitles for them in Hebrew and brought them to Nachum Barnea, the most important columnist, the Tom Friedman of Yediot Achronot. And Nachum Barnea said, "I won't publish this." And he went to the Israeli television. There was only one channel back then, and he said, and they said, "We won't publish it either." And so the Israeli public was duped. So was I, by the way. I was a supporter of Oslo.
So was I.
And I did not know that Yasser Arafat his intention is malicious. And then buses started exploding.
Okay, so we agree then that the people running Israeli society, the bosses of the media.
No, I don't know what you mean by running Israeli society.
Well, I mean the political bosses, the bosses who sold
they're not bosses; they're elected politicians.
Well, you've been defending the view that elected politicians in Israel have zero power.
But they had power. Back then they had power.
But it was being eroded already, I think. But let's say they had power.
The real revolution, the judicial revolution of Aaron Barak started in the mid-90s.
Fine. So Israeli bosses who did have power still in the period 1991 to 1995.
Israeli politicians. Bosses is a term from another world.
Well,
These are elected politicians.
Yes, but when they don't behave...
They're not our bosses.
But when they behave... Well, that's for you to decide. So Israelis are the ones who either decide they will become bosses or public servants. So when Israelis acquiesce in the behavior of these elected politicians...
Acquiesce, they supported them.
Okay. Well, if you don't resist when the elected politicians betray their promises. Benjamin Netanyahu.
What do you mean resist?
Okay, so this is what I mean. Benjamin Netanyahu, he promised to cancel Oslo every time he ran for prime minister. And then the minute he was elected, he pushed the Oslo process even faster.
No, he didn't. He eroded and finally released us from the Oslo tunnel.
What is that? What is that analysis? Let's hear it.
What he did was begin to demand reciprocity, and he knew that the Arabs would never agree to a Jewish state. So he said, fine, so if you're talking about a two-state solution, why don't you acknowledge the right of the Jews to a state of their own? And the Palestinians couldn't do it because they support the right of return. So when they say two states, they never say two states for two peoples. They say two states living side by side in peace. And they mean one Palestinian state, Yud 9, without Jews, and the other a state of all its citizens into which the descendants of the refugees will come back. So Netanyahu put the right obstacle in front of them and gradually released us from the Oslo trap.
Okay, why didn't he immediately and completely release you from the Oslo trap?
Because it was impossible internationally.
Why?
And internally.
Why is it impossible internationally?
Because
why does an Israeli prime minister need to do anything that the president of the United States or the president of any other country demands? Why?
Have you been here during Iron Swords?
Sure. No, I was not here.
You're not?
No.
So you would have known that they were stepping on our oxygen supply, which is ammunition. We had no ammunition.
Right, but you had no ammunition because you chose to be dependent on U.S. ammunition.
Yeah,
right?
But do you think we can fight the U.S.? Do you think we can directly confront the U.S.? Because I think...
Are you imagining that the U.S. would ever have the right political grammar to launch a direct attack on Israel? Are you afraid of that?
The United States almost annihilated the state of Israel.
When?
And by acquiescing to the Iranian nuclear program.
Well, then they're not your friends. That's my point. If the U.S. government...
They're not always our friends. It depends. The Democratic Party is certainly not our friends. And had Kamala Harris been elected, the existence of the state of Israel would have been in danger.
Okay, so if you believe that the people running the United States are not your friends, you should not be dependent on them, right? When we go back to the decision...
Oh, I'm all for that.
Right, so when we go back to the decision to become dependent on the U.S. For armaments, right? That decision was acquiescing to what the U.S. president wanted. He wanted to be for U.S. arms manufacturers to be selling arms to Israel.
And
right?
he wanted to exercise influence on our policy.
But that's the decision that Israeli bosses should have refused.
What is the alternative?
The alternative is to be independent in arms production, you don't have to.
But can you be completely independent? Not in arms production. In total, can you be completely independent?
Well, no country can ever be completely independent, but also no country should be run by foreign bosses, right?
That's true.
Right. So Israeli foreign policy...
No, but you were saying before that why does Israel take into account what America thinks or what anybody thinks? Is the reason is Israel cannot survive without any superpower
okay, fine.
Support.
Here's
Ben-Gurion thought so, and he always made... Ben-Gurion, mind you, faced the United States and the Soviet Union together in '56. Mm-hmm. But he was always in search of a superpower ally because Israel is a tiny little country in a huge hostile area.
Fine, but here's the question. If the people running Israel, if the Israeli bosses, as I insist in calling them, can do something that is very easy and cheap to do, that will protect the state of Israel, they should do it. Especially if it's something that the President of the United States cannot do anything about.
We've made the serious mistakes.
Okay, well, you call them mistakes, but I say that if the Prime Minister of Israel does not explain to the Israeli people that the organization they are bringing into the Jewish state, created to protect the Jews from genocide, is an organization that created the Iranian jihadi state that is promising to commit genocide, If the Israeli prime minister does not explain that to the Israeli public, that's not a mistake. Error is not the right category for that behavior.
Well, Netanyahu has been warning continuously of Hamastan. This is why he
No, but that's not the same.
He was against Oslo, and then he was against...
And this, in my view, is a historical error. So the Oslo was constructed out of the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991. That's where all this business began.
In which we were forced to participate.
You were not forced to participate.
No.
You chose to participate. This is very important. I think the security...
It was Shamir. Was
Yitzhak Shamir.
There was no more stubborn prime minister ever in Israel and more resistant
Evidently,
to
he
pressure.
could be even more stubborn because he went
How do you know that?
Because he went to Madrid.
How do you know that they didn't have leverage to suffocate us? How do you know that?
Well, I know.
How do you know that they couldn't pass a Security Council resolution demanding inspection of our nuclear facility?
All right. So
how do you know that?
Okay, fine. So you're saying that it is possible to exert sufficient pressure on Israel that will justify an Israeli prime minister bringing the people who want to commit genocide against the Jews into the Jewish state. You're saying there is some kind of pressure that could make that justifiable. I claim that if an Israeli prime minister bends to any pressure to improve the position of people who want to murder all of the Jews, he has acted incorrectly, immorally.
So everybody has acted incorrectly.
Well, not everybody, but the point I was going to make is that the person responsible for getting this train in motion, the Oslo train in motion, is actually Netanyahu, because he was the Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs in 1991, present in Madrid, who for the first time in Israeli history negotiated with PLO Fatah. There was a taboo against any negotiation with PLO Fatah.
That was not his call.
Well, you can resign.
Yeah,
you don't. If you're an Israeli,
but what is this black and white?
I think it's black and white. I think if people want to murder all of the Jews, that's black and white. That's black. That's what I'm saying. This is black and white. So if there's a group that wants to murder all of the Jews, you can't bring it into the Jewish state.
But if you think that you can neutralize it by playing this game, then you should do it.
Exactly. So what the Israeli prime minister should have done, whoever he was, when the U.S. pressure began to bring PLO Fatah into the Jewish state, all that the Israeli prime minister needed to do was convene a live press conference.
That was Rabin.
Whoever it was. We're talking about Yitzhak Shamir. He was being pressured to negotiate.
You're talking about 91.
Right, 91. So all that he needed to do was to convene a live press conference. Nobody can stop a live press conference. And Israel is always front page news everywhere in the world. So if the Prime Minister of Israel convenes a live press conference to make an important announcement about the Arab-Israeli conflict, they will all show up. You're transmitting live, okay? And then he uses that opportunity to explain to the Israelis and to the whole world that the U.S. government is pressuring him to allow inside the Israeli state, the Jewish state, created to protect the Jews from genocide, an organization that created Jihadi Iran, which is promising to commit genocide. And he lays out. Wait.
They kept saying it.
No. They never explained this. If you lay out the documentation showing that PLO Fatah created Ayatollah Khomeini, the Oslo process becomes impossible.
But why do you need that if you can prove that the Fatah is bent on destroying the Jewish state, with or without Iran? That's what they said repeatedly.
Listen.
They said, is it not enough on your premise to say that you can't bring in a band of murderers bent on destroying the Jewish people?
Right, but the story that was sold to the Israelis is that these murderers had learned the language of peace.
Yeah,
that they were going to abandon.
Shamir never acquiesced to that.
Fine,
and
but
neither did Netanyahu.
Give me just 1 second to ask my question.
It's your program. You can take.
Thank you. So the idea is, do you really believe that if it had been explained to the Israelis in 1991 that PLO Fatah had created Iran, if that had been explained, do you think the Oslo Accords would have gotten a pro vote in the Israeli Knesset?
I think that the relevant question is, what is the intention of the PLO? not what its
Well,
was.
if the PLO is the creator of the state and the creator of the terrorist institutions of the state that is promising to commit genocide in Israel, the intention of the PLO is very clear.
But this is the argument. What are the intentions of the PLO?
If the PLO creates jihadi Iran...
And the right kept saying the intentions of the PLO are destroying the
Right,
Jewish
but they
people.
needed to prove it so that the vote in the
That
Knesset
doesn't
would have been
prove it.
against.
That doesn't prove it.
It does?
No, it doesn't. It
You don't
doesn't.
think it does?
No, I don't think it does. I think what proves it is that Arafat kept saying that his intention is jihad. And the idea that this connection seems to me, if I don't know as much as you do about this, but it seems to me technical. They helped with guerrilla.
Right.
The Iranian state is so much more sophisticated than the Fatah.
But they created the terrorist institutions of Iran.
The author of the Iranian noose is Qassam Soleimani. And then the Hamas learned everything they know from Hezbollah and from Iran. The Palestinian Fatah and the Palestinian Hamas were nothing without Iranian backing.
So you think it was moral for Israeli leaders not to explain the relationship between PLO, Fatah, and Iran before bringing the Oslo Accords to a Knesset vote?
I don't think it's important.
Wow. If you don't think that's important, then...
I think that the relevant factor is what are the intentions of Yasser Arafat.
Well, but...
That's the relevant factor.
But
and you're using circumstantial evidence to prove the
No, it's not
intentions of Arafat.
circumstantial.
Of course it's circumstantial. Because it's not a direct testimony to Arafat's opinion.
Okay, but...
And we have Arafat's voice. Why do we need anything else?
Fine.
Arafat was never... it was never his intention to acquiesce to the existence of a Jewish state.
Fine, I'll tell you why you need something else. Because the media barrage, the media management of reality that was sold to Israelis was that the word jihad had more than one meaning in Islamic culture.
Yeah.
And when they put those recordings of Arafat speaking about jihad, what everybody was told by Western university professors in the media is that he didn't mean exactly that he meant a personal struggle, nothing to do with holy war. Okay, so that's why you needed. That's the reason that you needed, as an Israeli leader, to show them that PLO Fatah was the same thing as Iran, because the meaning of jihad is the meaning that Iran gives to it. And then they would have won the argument, and the Knesset vote would not have been pro-Oslo. It won by one vote. One vote. Therefore, if all Israelis had understood...
Yeah, well, you know, that's your hypothetical theory. I'm not an expert.
Okay, well, anyway, that's my argument. They're telling me that we have to finish up because we're out of time. But I have to say, this was a very big pleasure. I'm I feel like I understand the Israeli constitutional crisis a lot better now. So thank you so much for that. I think people outside of Israel will understand it better too. And I hope you learned something too. And I will.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to converse with you.
I hope we can converse again. I hope it'll be the first one of many.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody. This is Francisco Gil-White with Gadi Taub for our joint program with Harutz Tov and Management of Reality. Remember, you can find all of our content in managementofreality.com, and I hope that we will continue to have conversations like this one. Thank you,
very
Gadi.
much.